Hey there. Welcome back to The Sleepy Dread. I'm Ollie, and I'm glad you're here. Tonight, I have something different for you. Something older and stranger than usual. A story that's been sitting with me for a long time, the way some stories do. The ones that don't let go. It's called Lazarus. It was written by a Russian author named Leonid Andreyev back in 1906. Now, you probably know the name Lazarus from the Bible, the man who died and was raised from the dead by Jesus. That much is familiar, but Andreyev asked a question that the Bible never answers. What happened after? What was it like to come back? And what did Lazarus bring back with him from the other side? This is my retelling. The bones of the story are Andreyev's, the words are mine. So settle in, pull the covers up, close your eyes if you like. Let the day fall away from you, and let's go to a place where the sun is hot, the stone is ancient, and a dead man has just come home. The evening was warm, and the air smelled of bread and roasted lamb, and the heavy sweetness of wine. There were lanterns strung in the courtyard of the house in Bethany, and their light fell in soft, trembling pools across the stone floor. People had come from all over, neighbors, friends, strangers who had heard the news and wanted to see for themselves. The tables were laden. The music was bright. Laughter spilled out into the narrow streets like something overflowing. It was a feast, a celebration, because Lazarus had come home. 3 days he had been dead. 3 days in the tomb, wrapped in burial linen, sealed behind stone. His sisters Martha and Mary had wept for him, had sat Shiva, had begun the long, slow work of learning to live without him. And then he came back. He was raised. He walked out of that tomb and into the blinding light of a Judean afternoon, and the word spread through the countryside like fire through dry grass. A miracle, the greatest miracle. Death itself undone, and so they celebrated. Of course they did. What else do you do when the impossible happens? You light the lamps, you pour the wine. You fill the house with music and warmth and the sound of human voices, because your brother is alive and nothing else matters. The courtyard filled quickly. Neighbors brought dishes of lentils and figs and flatbread still warm from the oven. Someone brought a stringed instrument and played it softly in the corner. Children chased each other between the tables. The air was thick with heat and spice, and the sweet, heavy perfume of the jasmine that grew along the courtyard wall. It was, by every measure, a night of joy. The kind of night that should have been remembered for years afterward, as the happiest anyone could recall. Martha moved through the feast with bright, busy energy, refilling cups, adjusting lanterns, making sure everyone had enough. She was the practical one, the organizer, and she threw herself into the work of celebration the way she threw herself into everything, completely, without rest. But if you watched her closely, you might have noticed that she never looked at Lazarus for very long. A glance, a quick smile, and then away, as though looking at him directly was something she could only manage in small doses. Mary was quieter. She sat near her brother and held his hand and said very little. Her eyes were red. People assumed she had been crying from joy, and perhaps she had. But there was something else in her face, something careful and uncertain, the way you might look at a beloved object that has been broken and repaired. The shape is right. The pieces are all there, but you can see the cracks, and you know it will never be quite the same. And Lazarus sat at the head of the table. He was there, and he was alive. And that should have been enough. But something was wrong. Not obviously wrong, not in a way you could point to and name. It was more like a feeling, a weight in the air around him that didn't match the music or the lanterns or the laughter. He sat upright in his chair, and he ate when food was placed before him, and he drank when a cup was put in his hand. But his movements were strange, slow and deliberate, the way a man moves when he is thinking very carefully about each action, as though the simple business of living, lifting a cup, chewing bread, turning his head, was something he had to remember how to do. His skin had a grayish quality to it. Not the gray of illness, exactly, but something deeper, a pallor that seemed to come from underneath the skin, as though the color of the tomb had soaked into him and would not wash out. His cheeks were hollow. The flesh of his face hung differently than it had before, the way fabric drapes over an unfamiliar frame. And his eyes were the worst of it. They were open, and they moved, and they looked at things. But they didn't see the way other eyes see. There was no warmth in them, no recognition, no spark of the man who had once laughed easily and loved his sisters, and argued cheerfully with his neighbors about the price of grain. Lazarus's eyes were dark and still, and impossibly deep, like wells that had no bottom. And when they settled on you, when they found your face and held it, something cold moved through you, something vast and empty and very, very quiet. People noticed, not all at once, and not all of them. The feast was loud and the wine was flowing, and most of the guests were too caught up in the miracle to pay close attention to the man at its center. But here and there, someone would find themselves sitting across from Lazarus, would meet his gaze by accident, and would go still. A man who had been laughing stopped mid-sentence. He stared at Lazarus for a long moment, his mouth slightly open, his cup forgotten in his hand. Then he set the cup down very carefully and stood and walked out of the courtyard without saying a word. His friends called after him. He didn't turn around. A woman who had come to pay her respects leaned across the table to speak to Lazarus, smiling, reaching for his hand. And then she saw his eyes. Her smile didn't fade so much as collapse, like a structure whose supports had been pulled away. She drew her hand back. She pressed it against her chest. She stayed for the rest of the evening, but she didn't speak again. The music kept playing, the lanterns kept burning, but the feast grew quieter as the night wore on, the way a fire grows quieter as its fuel runs out. People drifted away in twos and threes, offering their congratulations to Martha and Mary, carefully not looking at Lazarus as they left. By midnight, the courtyard was nearly empty. The tables were cluttered with half-eaten food and overturned cups. The lanterns guttered in the breeze. Martha cleaned up. Mary sat in the corner, her arms wrapped around herself, watching her brother from across the room. Lazarus sat where he had been sitting all evening. He hadn't moved. The lantern light played across his face, and his eyes were open, and he was looking at nothing, or at something that no one else could see. In the days that followed, word continued to spread. People came to Bethany to see the man who had been raised from the dead. They came out of curiosity, out of faith, out of the simple human need to witness the impossible. And most of them left satisfied. They saw a man, alive, walking the dusty streets of a small town in Judea. Proof that death could be defeated. Proof that miracles were real. But some of them stayed too long. Some of them got too close. There was a sculptor who came from the coast. A Greek, a man who worked in marble and clay, who had spent his life shaping beauty out of raw stone. He was famous for his figures, graceful, proportioned, radiant with the kind of idealized humanity that the Greeks loved. He came to see Lazarus because he wanted to carve the face of a man who had conquered death. He imagined the sculpture already, noble, triumphant, luminous with resurrection. He sat with Lazarus in the courtyard of the house. He studied his face. He looked into his eyes. He went home, and he never carved a beautiful thing again. What came from his hands after that were twisted, misshapen forms, figures that seemed to be collapsing inward, faces caught in expressions of bewildered anguish, bodies that looked as though they were trying to fold themselves out of existence. He worked feverishly, unable to stop, producing piece after piece of the same incomprehensible horror. His patrons were disturbed. His students left him. He didn't notice. He was looking for something in the clay, some shape he had seen in Lazarus's eyes, and he couldn't find it, and he couldn't stop looking. They found his workshop full of those figures when he died. Hundreds of them. All wrong, all reaching for something that wasn't there. There was a man named Aurelius, a cheerful man, a lover of life. He drank well and ate well and laughed with his whole body. He was the kind of person who fills a room just by walking into it. The kind of person who makes other people feel more alive simply by being nearby. He had a gift for joy. It was as natural to him as breathing. He went to see Lazarus on a dare. His friends had told him about the dead man's eyes, about the strange effect he had on people. And Aurelius had laughed and said it was superstition. Lazarus was just a man, he said. A man who had been very sick and recovered. Nothing more. He sat down across from Lazarus in the shade of an old fig tree. The afternoon was hot, and the dust hung in the air like golden powder, and the shadows were sharp-edged and very dark. Aurelius smiled his easy smile and asked Lazarus how he was feeling. Lazarus looked at him. It didn't take long, a few seconds maybe, a few seconds of those still bottomless eyes resting on his face, and something inside Aurelius shifted, not broke. That would imply violence. It was more like a door opening onto a room he had never known was there. A vast room, an empty room. A room with no walls and no floor and no ceiling, stretching in every direction, forever. He got up from the table. He walked home. He sat down in his chair by the window. He was not the same after that. The joy was gone, not suppressed, not hidden, but gone, the way color drains from fabric left too long in the sun. He ate, but found no pleasure in food. He drank, but the wine tasted like water. He looked at the faces of his friends, his family, the people he had loved, and he could not remember why any of it had ever mattered. The world looked different now. Not darker. That wasn't quite right. It looked thinner, as though the whole bright, busy spectacle of life, the colors, the music, the laughter, the love, was a painted curtain hung over something else, something behind it, something that was vast and still and had always been there, patient and absolute, waiting for the curtain to fall. Aurelius stopped going out. He stopped speaking. He sat by his window and looked at the sky, and his face held no expression at all. He died within the year, not of illness, not of injury. He simply stopped, as though the mechanism that kept him going, the will, the appetite, the stubborn animal insistence on another breath, another heartbeat, another day, had been quietly switched off. His friends said it was as if the light went out of him, and it had. That was exactly what had happened. Others suffered the same fate. A young couple who had come to Bethany on their wedding journey, full of the blind confidence of new love. an old rabbi who thought his faith would protect him, a soldier who thought he feared nothing. Each one looked into the eyes of Lazarus, and each one found the same thing there, not malice, not evil, not any kind of active cruelty, just emptiness. An emptiness so vast and so complete that it made everything else look like a dream. The whole teeming world of the living, the desires, the fears, the ambitions, the loves, reduced to a thin, bright noise, playing at the edge of an infinite silence. Some went mad. Some simply grew quiet and still, and eventually stopped breathing. Some carried on with their lives, but differently, as though they were walking through a world they no longer believed in, going through motions that no longer meant anything, waiting, patiently, without hope or fear, for the emptiness they had glimpsed to finally arrive and make itself permanent. People began to avoid Lazarus. The visitors stopped coming. The streets of Bethany emptied when he walked through them. Doors closed. Shutters were drawn. Children were pulled inside. Even the dogs shrank away from him, pressing themselves against the walls of the houses, their tails between their legs. Martha and Mary kept their door open. They were his sisters, and they loved him, and love does not give up easily. But they had learned not to look at his eyes. They spoke to him with their gazes fixed on his hands or his feet or the wall behind him. They cooked his meals and washed his clothes and made sure he ate, and they did it all without once meeting his gaze, the way you might tend a fire without looking directly into the flame. At night, Lazarus would go out to the edge of the town and stand in the desert, alone. The stars above him were thick and bright, and the sand stretched away in every direction, pale in the moonlight, and he stood there motionless for hours, a dark figure against the empty land. No one knew what he looked at. No one knew what he was thinking. Perhaps he was not thinking at all. Perhaps he was simply standing in the presence of something he had seen on the other side, something too large and too simple for thought, and letting it fill him, the way the desert fills with silence after the last sound has died away. Eventually, word reached Rome. It came the way all strange news came to the capital in those days, through traders and soldiers, and the long, tangled chain of gossip that connected the provinces to the center of the world. A man raised from the dead, they said. A man whose gaze could destroy the will to live. Augustus Caesar heard the reports and was interested. Not frightened, not awed, but interested. He was the emperor of the known world. He had conquered nations, built roads, reshaped the map of civilization. He had looked upon death many times, on battlefields, in senatorial chambers, in the faces of men who knelt before him knowing they would not rise. Death was not new to Augustus. What was new was the idea that someone had seen the other side of it and come back. He sent for Lazarus. It was a long journey from Bethany to Rome, weeks of travel across sea and land, through dust and heat in the crowded ports of the Mediterranean. And when Lazarus arrived in the imperial city, he came not as a curiosity, but as a guest, received with the careful, measured courtesy that Rome extended to things it did not yet understand. The palace was vast. Marble floors, columns, long corridors lit by oil lamps that threw shifting shadows across the walls. Augustus received Lazarus in a private chamber, not the throne room, not a public audience. A small room with heavy curtains and a single window that looked out over the city. The evening light came through it, warm and golden, and fell across the emperor's face. Augustus was old. His hair was thin and white. His skin was papery and spotted with age, and his hands trembled slightly when he lifted them. But his eyes were clear, sharp, the eyes of a man who had spent a lifetime seeing through pretense and measuring the distance between what people said and what they meant. He had survived decades of political murder, civil war, betrayal, and ambition. He had outlasted every rival. He had built an empire, and he intended to enjoy what remained of his life. He looked at Lazarus, and Lazarus looked back. The room was very quiet. The sounds of the city, the carts, the voices, the distant clatter of hooves on stone, faded away, or seemed to. The golden light in the window dimmed. The shadows in the corners of the room grew deeper and heavier, and began to press inward, the way darkness presses against a candle flame. Augustus felt it. He felt it the way all of them had felt it. The sculptor, the joyful man, the newlyweds, the rabbi, the soldier. A door opening inside him, a vast space beyond it, an emptiness without boundary or feature or end, stretching in every direction, patient, absolute, indifferent, not hostile, not cold, just empty. The way the sky is empty above the clouds, the way the ocean is empty below its surface, an emptiness that had always been there, behind everything, beneath everything, and would still be there long after the last star went dark and the last voice fell silent, and there was nothing left to remember that anything had ever existed at all. He felt his will begin to crumble. He felt the bright certainty of his life, the conquests, the laws, the monuments, the empire, begin to thin and fade, the way a painting fades when the varnish is stripped away. Beneath the glory, beneath the ambition, beneath the iron discipline that had held him together for 70 years, there was nothing, just the void, just the infinite, indifferent silence that Lazarus had carried back from the dead. Augustus looked into it. He looked for a long time, and then he looked away. It cost him something. You could see it in his face, the effort, the sheer force of will it took to turn his gaze from those dark, bottomless eyes. His jaw tightened. His hands gripped the arms of his chair. A vein stood out on his temple, and for a moment his whole body trembled, as though he were lifting something impossibly heavy. But he did it. He looked away. He was Augustus. He was Caesar. He was the Emperor of Rome, and he had not survived this long by surrendering to things that frightened him. He had looked into the void, and the void had looked back, and he had chosen, by sheer, brutal imperial will, not to fall. He sat for a while, breathing. His hands were still shaking. The color returned to his face slowly, like dawn coming back after a long night. The golden light in the window steadied. The sounds of the city filtered back in. A cart rattling over cobblestones, a vendor's distant call, the ordinary music of a world that was still stubbornly going about its business. The room became a room again. The marble was just marble. The curtains were just curtains. But something in Augustus was different now. Something had been subtracted. He would never speak of it. Not to his advisors, not to his wife, not to anyone. But for the rest of his life, in quiet moments, in the small hours before dawn, when the palace was still and the oil lamps burned low, he would remember what he had seen behind those eyes, and he would feel it tugging at him, gently, patiently, the way a current tugs at a swimmer who has ventured too far from shore. He had survived it, but he had not escaped it. And then Augustus spoke. He spoke quietly, the way a man speaks when he has just come very close to something he cannot name. He said that Lazarus must be blinded. He said it without anger, without malice, without cruelty. He said it the way a man might say that a well must be sealed because the water in it is poisoned. not because the water is evil, but because people will drink from it, and they will die. Hot irons, he said, both eyes, and then send him away. It was done that night. The guards held Lazarus still, and the irons were heated in a brazier until they glowed the color of sunset, and they were pressed against his eyes, and there was a sound, a hiss, brief and final, and then it was over. Lazarus did not scream. He did not struggle. He sat perfectly still through all of it, his face turned upward, his expression unchanged. And when it was done, and the irons were pulled away, and his eyes were dark and ruined and sealed shut forever, he looked exactly the same. His face held the same emptiness it had always held. The void behind his eyes was no different from the void that was now in front of them. They led him out of the palace and through the streets of Rome. People stepped aside as he passed. They didn't know who he was or what had happened, but something about the blind man walking between two soldiers made them uneasy. The way his feet found the ground so carefully, the way his ruined face was tilted slightly upward, as though he were listening to something very far away. They put him on a ship, and the ship carried him east, and eventually he found his way back to the desert. Not to Bethany, not to his sisters. There was nothing for him there now. Nothing for him anywhere, really. The world of houses and streets and people and conversation was a world that no longer concerned him. It was a bright, busy place, full of urgent, temporary things, and he had seen beyond it. And what he had seen could not be unseen, even with ruined eyes. He walked into the desert. The sun was enormous and white, and the sand stretched to the horizon in every direction, featureless and still. The heat pressed down on him like a hand. His shadow moved beside him, short and dark and faithful, the only companion he had left. He walked slowly, the way he had always moved since coming back, deliberate, patient, as though he had all the time in the world, which in a sense he did, and in another sense he had none at all. The desert did not mind him. The desert was, in its own way, the closest thing on earth to what Lazarus had seen on the other side. Vast, empty, indifferent. A place where the bright noise of human life could not reach, where the silence was so deep and so old that it felt like a presence in itself. Lazarus walked through it the way a fish moves through water, not struggling against it, not fighting it, but simply existing within it, part of it, at home in the emptiness the way he could never again be at home among the living. Days passed, weeks. He did not eat. He did not drink. His body, which had already died once and been called back against its will, moved through the desert on some momentum that had nothing to do with nourishment or rest. His skin darkened and cracked. His lips split. His robes, already worn thin, turned the color of the sand. He became difficult to distinguish from the landscape. A figure that might have been a man, or might have been a dead tree, or might have been a trick of the heat shimmered on the horizon. Travelers who passed through the desert sometimes saw him. A blind man walking alone, his face turned toward a sun he couldn't see. His steps slow and even and endlessly patient. They gave him a wide berth. There was something about him that discouraged approach. Not danger, exactly, but a kind of gravity, a heaviness in the air around him, as though the emptiness he carried had weight, and the closer you got, the more you felt it pulling at you, pulling at the small, bright, stubborn things that kept you going. Your plans, your appetites, your reasons for getting up in the morning. Better to walk on, better not to look too closely, better to let the blind man have his dessert, and his silence, and whatever it was he was walking toward. And eventually, Lazarus died. His second death. It came quietly, the way everything about him was quiet now. He simply stopped walking. He stood still for a moment, his face tilted toward the sky, his ruined eyes seeing nothing and everything. And then his knees buckled, and he folded gently onto the sand, and he was gone. The desert covered him. The wind moved the sand over his body in slow, patient drifts, grain by grain, until there was nothing to see, just the flat, featureless land, stretching away to the horizon, the same as it had always been. The sun went on burning. The sky went on being empty. And the silence, that vast, old, indifferent silence, went on being silence, the way it had before Lazarus, and the way it would after, and the way it always would. Long after every story had been told and every voice had fallen still, there was no marker, no grave, no one to mourn him, just the desert, and the wind, and the slow, patient work of sand covering over the place where a man had been. And that's Lazarus. Leonid Andreyev wrote that story in 1906 in Russia during one of the darkest periods of his country's history. And I think you can feel that darkness in it. Not the darkness of monsters or ghosts, but the darkness of a question that has no answer. What is on the other side? And what would it do to you to know? The thing that stays with me is that the void isn't evil. It's not trying to hurt anyone. It's just there. It's always been there. And Lazarus is not a villain. He's a witness. He saw something true, and the truth of it was too large for the living world to hold. Anyway, thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for listening. I hope the story settles over you like a blanket rather than keeping you awake. If you'd like more nights like this, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be here whenever you need a voice in the dark. Close your eyes now, if they aren't already. Let the fire die down. Let the silence be a comfortable one. Good night. Sleep well.